I came across this old metal toolbox full of keys that my dad had collected over the years. I found a couple cool projects that I've been able to incorporate them in. Sorting through and organizing the keys was the first task. I actually pulled aside all the brass keys and used them in another video where I made this countertop for our garage and inset them in resin. I learned a lot from that project. Do's, don'ts, and I was able to incorporate them into this project. I also had a lot of keys left over, so I had a couple little trial and errors that I was able to experiment with. In this video, I'm going to share with you what I learned about working with epoxy and keys, how I made this cool little side table with hairpin legs, and how I made this fun little, what I'm going to call a wall art piece with antique keys. But without further ado, let's get into the video. I used a foam roller with flat black paint to cover a wood circle on all sides before laying out my key pattern. I started from the center and worked my way out, giving depth from the different sizes of keys. I didn't really have any pattern in mind. Really, all of my intention was when it came to the edge to make sure that I at least left an 1/8 of an inch border before gluing everything down. Once I had my design in place, all I had to do was glue it down as super glue. I started again from the center and worked my way out. I used paddle tweezers here and there where needed if I had to adjust a key, kind of like playing Operation. Once my design was glued into place, I did a little hand check to make sure that I didn't miss any keys. If I came across any loose keys or any that I noticed I missed, I just went back in, glued it, and made sure to set it into place. I did 2 small rounders with antique keys that had a lot of dimension to them that were going to need a deeper pour, but I also did 1 larger rounder that had all flat keys with silver tones that only needed about a 1/4 of an inch pour. This one will end up being the side table, and these other smaller ones will be wall art, but I still have a lot more keys for future projects. To turn this into a side table, I ordered these hairpin legs on Amazon. It came in a set of 4, but I kind of liked the idea of just doing 3, and it was perfect for this size. I installed the legs and traced everything out prior to doing the epoxy top just to make for easier assembly later. I have to give a big thank you to TotalBoat for sending over this Makerpoxy that's formulated by Jess. It's a 1-to-1 mix ratio, it's super easy to use, and the results are amazing. I also invested in myself and I got myself a torch because in the past I've used a heat gun and the results were just not the same. The ideal temperature when working with epoxy is 70 to 80 degrees, but it's been extremely cold in my garage, so I invested in this patio heater off Amazon, and I'm already in love because it just got it to the ideal temperature like that. Now, I had used this 3M tape before with epoxy, and it held up great with a heat gun, but this was the first time I had used a torch, and I found out quickly that this 3M tape just did not hold up well against the torch. But basically my idea here was to give myself a border to build up my resin pores. Now, because I had used the 3M tape before, I wanted to experiment with something new, this T-Rex tape, which is similar to like a duct tape. Maybe this is not the way to go. I wasn't sure if it was just the T-Rex tape, so I wanted to experiment with using the 3M as well to see if I got the same results. It's gonna probably do that no matter what, because I have a concave surface. I meant edge. Okay, we're having the same result here. It's like rippling. Well, I mean, I guess I just go for it. I persevered through and just let the tape do the work and didn't push as much on the edge, and I got ultimately the border I was looking for. I calculated exactly how much epoxy I needed for 1/8 inch pours on the TotalBoat website using their calculator, which was easy to use. This epoxy says to mix for 3 to 5 minutes, so I decided to mix it for about 4 minutes. Then I let it sit for about 1 minute before I actually pour, giving the bubbles a little time to rise to the surface. The epoxy is self-leveling, so it's going to find its way into all the nooks and crannies. But I find doing a circular pattern, working my way from the inside out, seems to work, and then coming back in and filling the voids that I miss. Then the last bit that I have in the container, I go back and fill all the little small keyholes. Then I hit it with the torch to break all the bubbles at the surface. Well, that definitely held up better than the 3M as far as against the torch. Coming for you. Boom! All better. Oh. looks like one. Oh, all right, it's gone. Once the first round had sat for 24 hours, it was time to come back in and do another 1/8 inch pour. The objective with the second pour is to cover all the keys. So with this one, I noticed I needed to come back and give just a little bit more to be able to cover those antique keys. Then I hit all those air bubbles with the torch. This is where you can really see that the 3M tape did not hold up against the torch and started to curl in, which caused me to have to do a lot more sanding in the long run. Once they had cured for 24 hours, I could remove the tape off the edges and prep them for their final pour. The 3M tape definitely did not hold up against the T-Rex tape. This stuff came off super easy, left no residue, was crystal clear, and I had little to no sanding. All I did was come in on the edges that were super sharp, round them over so that final pour has something to drift off of. Because the 3M tape didn't hold up as well against the torch, the edges curled in and caused the epoxy to dry in a curled edge. This required a lot more sanding to be able to get a smooth surface and that round over I'm looking for the final pour. I had to sand a little bit more aggressively with the smaller rounds, where I was able to get away with just my oscillating sander and a light sanding on the edge with the larger one. Man, that T-Rex tape made my life so much easier. I'll definitely be using that again in the future. Once everything was sanded, I came in and wiped everything down, brought in my shop vac, and made sure everything was clean and dust-free for that final pour. For the final pour, I tape off only the wood using the epoxy line as my guide. The smooth surface of the 3M tape works great for the final pour, allowing the epoxy to run off the edge but not stick to the tape. Now that the edges are taped off for the final pour, it's time to focus on the bottom. Because the epoxy is going to find its way underneath, I want to make cleanup as easy as possible. So this might be a little overkill, but I also had a lot of this tape on hand, so I figure it's better safe than sorry. Now all that's left is to get them level and ready for their final pour. I found that coating the edges first with the epoxy using a foam brush made that final pour that much smoother. And now for the final pour. I did the same spiral technique, starting from the center and working my way out to the edges. The final pour tends to be the messiest because of the excess epoxy that runs off the edges. I found that if I just leave it and let it dry in 24 hours, it's a lot easier to break the excess epoxy off of the cardboard than if I try to wipe it away when it's wet. There's something so satisfying about the final pour. Watching the edges become crystal clear again as the epoxy pours over the edges is so cool to see. I'm so glad I invested in a torch. The results were so much better compared to using the heat gun in the past. Once they had cured for 24 hours, all that was left was to come in and now pull off all the tape. Side note, taping off the bottom was a great idea because the epoxy did make it underneath and it made cleanup so much easier. The final reveal. This was also extremely satisfying, pulling back that 3M tape to see that crystal clear edge. I'm pumped how this little table turned out. Pretty proud of it. I learned a lot of things along the way, as well as implemented things that I learned from past projects. And I love this little wall hanger. I'm still not sure where I'm gonna place it yet. Maybe I'll hang it somewhere in the garage in honor of my dad. Thanks again, friends, for watching today's video, and until next time.